Welcome to Alternatively Speaking, a KCSA Podcast Labs production. This brand new podcast, where in our first season, we're going to be exploring a whole new concept when it comes to health span, longevity, and healthcare. A whole new industry has sprung up focused on longevity, but the idea of this industry isn't to see how long we can live, that's a part of it, but rather it's to see how healthy we can live for as long as possible. Today's episode is about how do we solve for increasing our lifespan. The XPRIZE Foundation was founded in 1994 by Peter Diamandis, a brilliant thinker, serial entrepreneur, medical doctor, and most importantly, a dreamer. The first XPRIZE used the power of incentive. Think a big, fat cash prize to make private space travel commercially available. Thanks to the Ansari XPRIZE, dozens of companies, individuals, and organizations attempted to win a $10 million prize purse by designing a reliable, reusable, privately financed spaceship capable of carrying 3 people to 100 kilometers above the Earth's surface within 2 weeks. Prior to the Ansari XPRIZE, space tourism was considered far too dangerous for the general public. But thanks to XPRIZE, we now see companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin, and Virgin Galactic flourishing. The idea of XPRIZE is simple. Define the problem facing humanity and map out a solution, no matter how big and bold. Raise a pool of money to fund a winner, publicize the prize, and invite collaborators from around the world to come together to work on a solution. In November of 2023, XPRIZE announced its biggest competition to date, a $101 million XPRIZE Health Span, designed to incentivize the creation of a proactive, accessible therapeutic that restores function by a minimum of 10 years with a goal of 20 years within 1 year of treatment. That sounds like a lot, but we're joined today by Jamie Justice, the Executive Vice President of Health Domain at XPRIZE Foundation, as well as the Executive Director of XPRIZE Health Span, and Adjunct Professor in Internal Medicine Section on Gerontology and Geriatric Medicine at Sticht Center on Healthy Aging and Alzheimer's Prevention at Wake Forest University School of Medicine. Without further ado, here is our interview with Jamie.
We are joined today by Jamie Justice, the Executive Vice President of Health Domain at XPRIZE Foundation, Executive Director of Health Span, XPRIZE, and Adjunct Professor in Internal Medicine Section on Gerontology and Geriatric Medicine at the Sticht Center on Healthy Aging and Alzheimer's Prevention at the Wake Forest University School of Medicine. Jamie, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. I'm glad to be here.
Before we get into all the issues around XPRIZE, your background is in gerontology and geriatric medicine, basically the study of aging. You're not old, you know, you're young. So what was it about this topic that drew you to basically build your career on this?
You know, it was the first subject that I absolutely fell in love with as a scientist. I was doing my graduate work at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and part of it started just
go Buffs.
Yeah, that's right. Go Buffs. And was there doing my my graduate study and was studying human performance and the neuromuscular control of movement. And and it started very practically, where my first studies in my master's degree were really around fatigue and human performance and really looking at young athletes. And what I learned working on an undergraduate campus is that when you do human research, is that often, especially if you're working with college-age students, they miss appointments. They don't come in. They're not as maybe dedicated. If you're doing translational work, working with young animals, they can often be quite aggressive. They're not the nicest animals to work around and do things with. And then, so I would say at the very earliest, in the practical sense, as I was asked to begin addressing questions around aging, and it was not my interest at all until I actually started working in it, meeting master's level athletes, talking about their performance and their health. And all of a sudden also had the realization of starting to work with older adults is, not only did they come to their appointments on time, I had some of them even bake me banana bread. When I had my son, when I was pregnant, they had baby showers for me. We'd go on walks and get coffees and, just really enjoyed because, with aging, it's like we tend to, I think, hyper focus on the health declines. And there's very real consequences. These are very real. But, aging is a gift. is that I got to spend time around people that had just incredible, rich lives with great experience and so much of it to share. So, I really benefited from the wisdom, the community, and the love. And it completely changed my thinking, and also changed my objectives from just thinking about how we can maybe make somebody's marathon time a little bit better to really, how do we keep people engaged, whether it's within their athletic community as a master's level athlete, or somebody who just wants to keep the stamina and the memory capacity to walk through a grocery store and remember their grocery list and have the energy to go home and put those groceries away, play with their grandkids afterwards. These things that really matter, that really transcend any disease state. And not only that, and then doing translational work, working with the older animals too, is that, we were basically running these, retirement colonies for various animals, and they're sweet and they don't bite you and they don't poop on your hand. And, it's like, it's all these
That's just
sort
a sign of love, by
things. The way. Yeah, exactly. So, and so I would say, I ended up developing, just, I would say, a very personal connection and a very deep empathetic love, and seeing a lot of the opportunity and the richness that actually this comes back and provides our societies and communities. And the other part of this, what really captured me though, is during that really critical transition point where it was practical, it was emotional, and then the curiosity came. Is I remember sitting in, it was a dual lecture series, is that on one side we had one of the greats in longevity science, actually two of the greats, and they had a point counterpoint discussion where we had the great Leonard Hayflick, who is responsible for something called the Hayflick limit. Looking at cells in a dish, and that over time, after they replicate, there's a certain number of replications where they stop. And this was called replicative senescence, and it was guarded by telomeres and telomere length. And so he was really the founder of that field. But he had all of these ideas about aging, where it was this very stochastic process where there's nothing you can do about it. You accumulate damage over time. These insults happen and your body can't keep up with it. And eventually you age and ultimately have a greater risk for death. On the other side of that, there was someone named Tom Johnson who was in behavioral genetics at University of Colorado. And he did some of the early work that led to some of Cynthia Kenyon's early discoveries. And they did a lot of work looking at something they called like gerontogenes, or these particular genes or genetic mutations that you can either insert, experimentally, or can also naturally occur, that you end up with some of these species that are incredibly long lived. And so even within this, if you have some of these mutations, either induced or otherwise, is you can extend lifespan. And lower organisms, that this is like a worm that suddenly lives twice as long as it should. And they're not just less dead, that they're alive, but they're mobile and they're doing things, So this is not really our Western perspective, right? Where we've had all these medical advances, where we're really good at making people less dead right now. But there's something really fundamental that really is the aging process that has nothing to do necessarily with death, that it's this process of degradation that we begin to observe within the behaviors, the functions, and ultimately health, disease, and risk of mortality. And so I just became really just... It was the first time after hearing this point counterpoint of thinking, is it stochastic? Is it gene-based? Is it programmed? Is it not? And then doing all of these multi-species work of saying, oh my gosh, you have these animals over here that can live for hundreds of years. And then you have these animals here that live for days. And just thinking whether it's between species or within species, the incredible variation, that it was the first time that I really sat down and just went, I had to have a lie down. It's like, why do we age? What is this? Why do we take it for granted? And why is it so different? And that there are really specific things that can be done, whether experimentally or otherwise, that seem to have really great effects about how variable this is, both within and beyond species. And so that was it for me, is that, it hit all three. It was personal, it was emotional, and I was captivated. And so that was really it. And so went from just studying the processes of aging and went into a postdoc study with someone by the name of Dr. Doug Seals in the Integrative Physiology of Aging lab, where we began looking at interventions, specifically interventions that can be done in humans. So not just like genetic manipulations that you can do in lab animals, but like what can you actually do in people that might extend, again, really looking at that health component. How do you change that rate of aging, that biology? And that we did this working both in mice and people, lots of intervention studies, did a lot of work with, vitamins, supplements, nutraceuticals, drugs, and lifestyle interventions. And doing them testing, I'd be in the clinic in the morning working with middle-aged and older adults. And we'd be testing the same therapeutics and lifespan studies in the afternoons. We had vivariums with mice and vessel studies. And again, really maintaining, which was basically, a retirement colony for mice of testing the same therapeutics, because there are questions you can look at in one or the other. And have just continued modeling that out and extending that work. At Wake Forest, began working with really, and I'll go into more of this if you want to, but, working on clinical trials, working on new therapeutics, working on new drugs, working on repurposed drugs, and even trying to create a regulatory pathway for aging, going from the cellular to the population. There are so many questions. It transcends any one disease. It is captivating. I get to work with the best people. The community of scientists working in are absolutely incredible. It's, I found my tribe. And so I just want to say for anybody out there, it has, whether you're older or not, like, how could you not want to study this thing that happens? We think it's universal, but it's the sign of success for any population. And we have the chance to make it better. And this is it is, I would say it's the best field to be in.
Well, so thank you. I mean, it makes complete sense, right? Like it was both serendipitous and intentional to get to where you got to.
Absolutely.
And I think about, my colleagues and I have spent, not an incredibly long time, but the last year or so trying to learn as much as we can about longevity, the science of longevity, who is working in this space, what is being done. And it seems like there are two camps, right? There's one camp that believes, I want to extend life as long as possible from a health perspective. Like, I want a health span, which means I'm going to live 100, 120 years really healthily, and then, kind of drop dead, right? So it's not this glide plane of pain and sorrow that we get with cardiac disease or diabetes or Alzheimer's and dementia, which is like this slow, painful decline, but rather I'm going to be able to run a marathon when I'm 119, I cross the finish line and I'm done. And, it's horrible and also good, right? Because you're healthy up until the last moment. And then there's this other camp that believes if I can just live a little longer, I can get to an escape velocity and maybe never die, except for dying from stupid, right? Dying from stupid is skiing without a helmet, driving a car without a seatbelt, crossing the street without looking both ways and getting whacked by our bus. We as a species are taught we are born to die, that every day we live, we are one day closer towards the end. I look at your face as we're talking. What do you think about that?
I think that's quite silly. I don't think I've ever met a biologist who's worked in the space who would ever say that we're born to die. We're born to live. Life begets life. As the chicken, the chicken's purpose is to make another egg. Is that, the egg makes a chicken to make another egg. Is that it doesn't make a chicken to die. Just biologically.
Well, let me rephrase that. Then we have an expiration date, right? Like you talked about senescence. Like there's this point where the cells cannot replicate and then they're done, right? We as individuals, not as a species, but as individuals, there's a best used by date, right? I mean, is your belief that we can indefinitely extend that best used by date, or that we're still going to have a point where, the body is going to stop?
Not my mission, not my goal, not my objective. There are people, and it's not that the two are mutually exclusive, but I got into this field working with people and watching animals and doing the work where, we have what J.L. Shansky calls a longevity dividend. And so J.L. Shansky is a great demographer, and he's done a lot of work really looking at what we currently have we've boosted our lifespan by already quite a staggering amount. It's one of the greatest human accomplishments, period. As that, we now live with an additional 30 years, now 28. We've gone back a little bit since pandemic, but we live with roughly another 30 years of life than we have ever had. And that we typically, when a species, how this happens, right, is that you also see this in the wild, is that if you have, I think Steve Ostad's done some really great work with opossums, or if you look at them in the wild in a place where there's really heavy predation, they biologically age a lot faster. They have maybe one litter of pups, a whole lot of them, and then shortly after they just start immediately declining, and their biology degrades quickly. That's aging. And they typically die really soon, and that this has happened over generations, right? This is, there's no advantage for them to maintain any of their repair processes because they're going to get eaten by a predator. And groups of opossums that live in a place where there's few extrinsic limits on their lifespan by things like predation is that there is a fundamental change in that biology. So that not only do they live longer, they live healthier. They have fewer pups, but more litters. They space it out a little bit more. They don't degrade quite as quickly. And so this is within one species, but in two different environments with different extrinsic factors that actually they change the intrinsic biology over many generations. So this is great. There's evidence of this other places, is that biology does catch up eventually, and it can fundamentally change their health and age. But we've done this in humans within a generation, maybe two, right? And so we're at the very earliest stages of this, where we've changed some of those extrinsic limits on our lifespan. We've done this by public health measures, primarily clean water, sanitation, lower maternal death rates, lower infant death rates, vaccination so that we die of less stupid things. We have improved trauma care. Right. So again, less stupid things. You're not going to fall off a horse and die. We can put people back together. And we've done a decent job at managing chronic conditions for a long period of time. But we still get those chronic conditions. We still have that intrinsic age limit that we have not overcome. And so we've extended life. We've taken off those extrinsic limits. And so what we have is a longevity dividend that's not matched by our biology yet. And so a lot of the work that I'm really interested in doing is saying, okay, we have these 30 years before we think about the next ones. And that might come as a consequence of doing the things of working on these fundamental aging processes. If that happens, fine, great. Not my objective. My objective is, what do we do now that we've taken out these extrinsic conditions to change our intrinsic biology so that we can match the extra life we're given in a faster timeline than waiting for those hundreds of generations to allow our biology to evolve? Is that, what can we do to maximize what we already have by working with the biology that we currently have? And so this is sort of a human optimization thing that we're going through right now. And so, so that's my fundamental question. I leave the longevity question to other people. Right now, that's a theoretical, and it's not my interest. What do we do now to maximize the life and the health that we have for the people already alive, and for the generations shortly thereafter? It's a very real question, and it's a major public health question. And it's a question that really drives a lot of the people that I have worked with, is that, what they want is not to live in a nursing home for an extra 10 to 12 years. Right now in the U.S., we have a 12-year gap between our life expectancy and our health adjusted life expectancy. And so what that means is how long we're living without major disabling chronic diseases, conditions, disabilities, or things that make us so that we are not engaged in our society, whether that's a major disease like Alzheimer's disease, whether it's, dealing with multiple cancers or trying to balance comorbid conditions, which is just many diseases that we don't know how to deal with that, either as a medical community or as a society. And that's the thing that I think terrifies most of the people that I work with. They're worried about being lonely. They're worried about not being engaged. They're worrying about not being able to interact with their family, their friends, get out of their house. And they're worried about that last 10 years that many of them are acting as caretakers for parents, loved ones, spouses. So that for me, that's what gets me out of bed is what are we doing with this extra life that we currently have? And if some of these interventions have a side effect of a longer life, so be it. So if that makes sense.
Can we talk for, it totally makes sense. And it's a good like pivot into XPRIZE.
Sure.
Right. So this past fall, the XPRIZE Health Span award program competition was announced. What was it about the XPRIZE structure that drew you? Right. Because it is a completely different idea of how to do science generally, right? Which is we're going to stick out this prize. Let's compete for the prize. Like that's not how traditionally big science has been done. Like you don't go out trying to win a Nobel Prize. And even though you may win it and you get $1 million, it's not so big that it would be an incentive in and of itself, but $101 million, that's a lot of money. And then on the other side, what is the objective of XPRIZE? Like, can you break down how the prize itself is going to work? So what drew you into the prize and what is it doing?
That's great. So I'll go into both. What drew me into the prize, I am an unrepentant academic. You can probably hear that in my descriptions of things.
Are your fingers stained? Like with the ink from
pretty much is that there are a few things I like better than waking up to a new journal article that hits my newsstand in my inbox in the morning, and still really enjoy digging into the data and analysis and beginning some of that interpretation. Love it. But what brought me into XPRIZE are the number of barriers. Is that some of these are both as an academic, love it very much, but there are major limits in terms of competing for funding, getting federal funding, and crazy ideas. And that honestly, the crazy ideas and the more audacious goals are very difficult to get funding for. Is that we have almost de-risked our academic institutions to the point that that it's almost impossible to get funding or to move the needle in a really big way. There are just I've heard recently called sort of we have it's an immune system problem. Is that anything that's outside the box our system tends to overreact and shut it down. And so as an academic, and certainly in the aging space, this is really true, is that some of these out there ideas, these things that could really make a change, is that, we've become so risk averse that even as scientists, is that some of those ideas get shut down. And so, what that might look like and what it's looked like for me is, that certainly big ideas, big initiatives that do require large federal funding are difficult to move forward. Also, major initiatives that, I spent about 8 years working first as an underling and a junior faculty, and then eventually on an executive committee for a trial called TAME, Targeting Aging with Metformin, that was designed to be the first clinical trial to create a regulatory pathway for aging as a target for drug development. It was a major initiative that was ultimately, our own peers, really, and the ability to get it funded and get it moved forward, because we're looking at not a disease outcome. but looking at sort of a multiple endpoint around aging and what do we call it and how do we do it. And in order to make really big changes like that change not just how we approach the science, but the policy behind it and how those major initiatives get funded, is that it was not impossible, but extremely difficult to do using traditional means. And so when XPRIZE knocked on my door, is that after spending 8 to 10 years, and as you mentioned, I'm still early in my career. There are folks on my group that I've worked with, like Nir Barzilai, Steve Krzyzewski, many others that were, they were working on this even before I joined them. But to start this over again 8 to 10 years later and start asking the same questions and having to go through the same process again to get that thing restarted, all of a sudden XPRIZE knocks on my door and it's like, okay, so I would have the chance to try to push the door from the other side, is that rather than pull and it won't open, if you go the other side and you give it a push, then what? Is there another way to do this? And I think XPRIZE has the opportunity to do that, is that, it does all the work that we need to do, which is get teams and groups together, get some agreement on what an endpoint would look like for trials, create a pipeline and a pathway towards regulation, and do things in a coordinated, harmonized way so that we can actually build the proof of concept needed to move and advance therapeutics that have the ability to target aging, to demonstrate to the world that this is possible, to demonstrate to our fellow scientists that this is something worthwhile to do, to create a groundswell large enough to move the needle for our regulatory officials who, again, they're not the holdup. I want to make that really clear. That's not their job. They don't sit around and come up with endpoints and outcomes for the scientific community. The scientific community has to bring it to them. But if we don't actually work together, we've made no progress towards that. And so working with this in this way is that we can now create a groundswell of investigators, of scientists, of investors in this field to show that this is real, this is viable. We can establish proof of concept. We can move together in harmony, make a concerted effort in one direction that would actually give us reason and the regulators reason to actually make a change, as well as federal funding. Is if we show this, that aging is viable, there should be more investment, more funding in this area to make it happen. So these big initiatives actually have a chance of surviving and making the impact that's truly needed rather than just funding one disease at a time, which is really, it's a fairly backwards model.
So Jamie, who are the types of organizations and individuals that are applying for this? It seems like they're going to need some sort of backing out of the gate.
Absolutely.
So are you seeing a flood of applications coming in now? And then how do you determine who the winner is at the end of the day?
Right. So those are two questions. So I'll address the first one, which is around funding, is that you're right. This is a prize model. And this is different than a grant application or other awards, is that what we're doing is we are setting up a game, a competition with an end goal. And I'll come into what that end goal is in a moment. But that's where, we give them, basically, it's a gigantic carrot on a stick that we ask our teams to chase. But in order to chase it, we don't provide the funding up front for the chase. So they have to have the backing and support in order to be prepared to compete. And where that backing and support comes from, right now, again, we're in an intent to compete period. We just launched in November. We call it an intent to compete, where we put out our guidelines, which I'll talk about the endpoints and the guidelines, what it takes to compete. We put that out in November, and we're taking public comment. What public comment means is that we're getting advice from our teams that are competing. Was just on a call this morning that we're hoping to get an audience with the FDA so that we can hopefully streamline approval processes. We're also talking to investors and funders to make sure they know what's happening and what our endpoints are, and to let them know that this is coming, is that they're probably going to have teams that are going to be asking or seeking funding. The teams that are coming in are from a variety of backgrounds. So far, within the first 2 months since we've launched, and again, we're not even in the official primary registration phase. That will start in July. But of those that are putting in their intent to compete, we already have well over 200 teams. I believe it's around 215 teams as of this morning. Of those, the majority, around 50%, are for-profit. Most of those are very early stage startups and early stage biotech companies. And so they're groups that are either in the pre-seed or early seed stages, and they're actively seeking investors. The number one barrier that our teams are coming in with is in the intent phase. If we say, what are your barriers to progress if you can't make it through? And what they say is that they need investors and they need funding. We also have academic and university and nonprofit teams coming in. For those academic and non-commercial teams, they're also looking for funding, and where they'll go for funding is whether those are through research foundations or through federal government sources. And so federal sources, if your teams are in the United States, that could be the National Institutes of Health, National Institutes of Aging, which I do through my academic background, have good relationships with some program officers there. And they already have existing concept areas and requests for applications that are open for persons who are interested in translational trials in aging, these early stage trials. They have grant mechanisms open. So some teams already either have grants or they're applying for those. And then, coupling that with either philanthropic organizations, foundations, or others. And so this is it's the number one question that's asked is, since we're not paying for the early stage trials, who will? Right. And that's across the board. That's why we run the competitions, is actually to stimulate investment and to stimulate investment in areas exactly like this. And so again, we dangle the carrot and we tell the teams, by any means you need to, please go search funding and get started. We'll have a couple of milestones that are sort of nominal financial amounts that are given to teams along the way that are for those that meet certain milestones. But they're certainly by no means enough to run one-year trials on their own. Really great question. And one that, again, we'll have investor summits and we have team summits along the way, so that persons either, they have VC or other investment groups, and also our foundations and federal agents and program officers, that they're welcome to hold informational sessions, meet the teams, talk to them about funding sources and funding strategies. Or for those that are interested in investment, there are certainly meet and greets and opportunities.
Perfect. So then just on my follow-up there, the second part, once everybody gets their initial funding out of the gate and they're going through, how do you pick the winner? Like, how does that?
That's great. So this is the biggest question. And this is one of the other major reasons I jumped to XPRIZE, is that this is the exact question that I've been asking at every stage of my career, is that if you have a therapeutic of any kind that can affect aging, how would you know? It's a question we've tried asking in mice. It's a question we've tried asking in monkeys. It's a question that we've tried asking again and again in humans. And so there's different levels of that. The FDA, their burden of proof is that you have to change the way an organism functions, feels, or survives. That's for any drug or therapeutic. Period, right? So that's it, is that anytime you do an intervention, there's a risk that an individual takes in taking that therapeutic above sort of their standard life. And so you have to meet those sort of burden of proof in order to show that the benefit outweighs the risk. And so that's just a fundamental for clinical research. So applying that as a principle back to how do you know you've changed aging? is that we want to change the way someone functions or feels. Survive, we have to take off the table for a for a very short trial, because that takes decades to see. So we are not going to wait decades for this prize to advance. And so that really leaves us, how do we change the way someone functions and feels in a way that we would say we have changed aging? And so we're looking really at function and feels. And when we look at aging, there are certain intrinsic things that happen that are not tied to a specific disease state. Because again, we want to make sure we're talking about aging, not disease. Which the two, there is a relationship there, that we're dancing around it just a bit, but this is very function forward. And so our winning teams, to get to that grand prize, our finalists have to look in 1 year, and the winning team has to demonstrate that their therapeutic, alone or in combination, can restore muscle, cognitive, and immune function. And it has to do so. We award it by the magnitude of the effect. And so the biggest award goes to those who show the greatest effect in 1 year across all three systems. The greatest effect, Peter Diamandis and I have had, I would say, the biggest headbutting contests over what that magnitude needs to be. Is I'm a trialist and a scientist, and we tend to de-risk. The craziest thing I could ever think about in any single domain would be a therapeutic that could change that rate of aging by 10 years. That's the craziest thing I could think of. I could see it maybe with an exercise study on changing something like cardiopulmonary exercise fitness by a VO2 max. There's been some evidence there. I'm like, you might get 10 years with a 1 year intervention, but you will never see it in cognition and immune. Never, never, never. So he said, well, great. So you give me 10 years. Let's make it all three, and let's push to 20, because he's an exponential guy. And he knows that if we really want to capture the public attention.
And he's 62.
And he's 62.
I don't think anybody, the reality is anybody who is paying attention to this most probably is a little bit older, right? It's not the 20-year-olds that are paying attention to this as much. It's more like the 50, 60-year-olds are like, I want to get more.
I would actually push back on that just a bit. Is that actually the folks that we see, that I meet actually, who are really captivated by the potential to improve and change aging, they're actually quite young. So we are seeing really great interest from people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, early 50s. So certainly adults, but really thinking about why and how we age, and are just thinking just out of the box enough to say, I think it's possible to make a change. And so that's really where we've captured a ton of attention, is not waiting to talk about aging until people are age-end, but to really think about aging as a lifespan process. It's that you don't reach some cliff and then you're old. This doesn't happen. Is that this is a life course approach. Is that, fundamentally the study of aging is the study of life and health. Mm-hmm. The study of life and health is lifelong. As you reach developmental maturity, reproductive maturity, and these processes already start. For women, ovarian aging starts in the 30s. It's that this is very real, and it's very prescient, and it's not just waiting until somebody's in their 60s. But for our prize, yes, those trials are in people who are already a bit older, because it's easier to demonstrate. Right, is that we want to show that there's a winner at 1 year. And if you want to see functional improvement in a lot of these measures, you have to at least start with some evidence of decline or risk. Again, we go back to that risk-benefit ratio, is that we want to have a population that already has enough risk that adding an intervention on top of is that certainly you're going to offset the risk. And two, you might be able to demonstrate an improvement, because we're not just talking about, can you just change how quickly you decline? We're talking about improvement. This is functional benefit in 1 year, and that benefit has to offset the expected rate of decline. So this is, I think, a fundamentally different concept than just counting diseases. It really is. We're talking about human health and optimization.
So go ahead,
Jamie.
Phil. Go ahead. You had your turn. I've done a lot of talking, so it's your turn.
Well, I was just wondering, is there anything that you're doing different as a result of your work, like supplements, exercise, cutting out fast food chains?
Personally? Okay. So great question. So the twofold. One, I'm an athlete. I'm a lifelong athlete. I love mountain sports, exercise. I also am and have been a vegetarian. Again, whether for health, personal reasons, environmental, ethical, all there. So that's one thing. And so I do tend to follow a healthy life, and one that I hope to tread lightly on the world that I live in. And then two, what do I do for supplements and other things? That's a different question. I am a scientist, and especially in the role that I've taken now, is that I choose not to take anything regular because I do not at any point want my judgment to become clouded. Is that this
Wait,
is
what does that mean? You don't take anything regular?
Is that, for instance, the other day I saw Peter and he tossed me, he said, hey, do you want, it was nicotinamide riboside, which is something that works through an energetic pathway. It's, many teams are testing it, they're looking at it, and he was like, here's an extra. So he tossed me a bottle of it. And it was like, oh, great, thanks. But I specifically, except for doing things for gut health, exercise, and, life, I don't take anything like metformin or rapamycin or, anything outside of general public health measures. And I don't do that specifically to maintain my objectivity. Not because I don't think they could work for me, but I also realize that I'm in a really delicate position as an executive director of a worldwide prize. And so I don't want my judgment or to have the perception that my judgment might be clouded by a therapeutic that may be tested by one of our teams. Once the 7-year prize is over, will I? Oh, you bet. But I'm not going to tell you guys what it is.
That's fine. I mean, I can tell you personally, like I have high blood sugar, right? I'm not diabetic. I'm pre-diabetic.
Right.
And I'm not obese, but I'm heavier than I should be. And I was taking berberine for a while, and then I switched over to metformin, and and I take a fistful of supplements every morning. I take anti-C, I take taurine, I drink AG1. Not a sponsor yet. We'd love them to be a sponsor, but I have a regular routine of supplements.
Absolutely.
I also exercise daily, at least 30 minutes of cardio plus weights, I don't want to die. And everything I've been reading, from Peter Diamandis to Peter Attia to Mark Hyman, like smart men. I wish there were more women who were equally as vocal as those three guys, but smart men who are talking about health from no glycophosphates, like being very careful of the food that I ingest.
Yes.
Like I live as healthy as I can because I want to live as healthy as long as I can. So
Correct.
If there was one thing or two things, because you just described being an athlete and being a vegetarian, do you think that, exercise and diet are the two key things to, a baseline long-term healthy lifestyle?
Yeah, those are great. So again, yes, I do actively partake of lifestyle, very much so. But and so those, I'm willing to go on record with those. I will not go on record for anything else. But again, yes, these are baseline. These are the things that we know, general public health measures. I get vaccinated regularly when and if needed, as do my children, because I'd rather not have any with the measles or polio, but, again, don't die of stupid. I think that's another one of Peter's big ones. All right. And, certainly all of that. So, the things that your grandmother has already told you, these are, certainly the things that I, as a base, certainly, is that there are, we have the benefit of having clean water. have the benefit of having sunlight, have the benefit of having, some balance in work and life. I'm terrible about sleep. And I wish I was better about that. And so, that's the one area of my life where I'm like, I hope I'm healthy enough in the other areas to make up for that. But you're absolutely right that there's a quality of medical care, of basic hygiene, of public health, and of baseline behavior characteristics that I partake in. And I don't ever want to take that for granted. So there are systemic public health things that are incredibly, incredibly important. Couple that on to having at least some genetic disposition. If we're looking at those who live a very, very long time, super agers, who I think you're going to have near bars to lie on. And when you have near bars to lie on, please talk to him about super agers, because it's an incredible group of people to study. I do not come from hobbits and super agers, so I need to do what I can for the public health and lifestyle things in order to maximize the years that I have. But I have this sort of baseline set that I will be able to build on. And so, I am still young, but, I am in my 40s. And so certainly looking forward, absolutely there are things that I do today that will have dividends for my health tomorrow. And so I don't neglect those things, even though I will never publicly go on air, at least while running these prizes. And I try to maintain my scientific objectivity and to remain free from conflict while I'm in this position.
That is a wonderful place to wrap up, Jamie. Thank you so much for being so generous, both not only with your time, but with your transparency, your honesty, and explaining what we're looking at here, because humanity is betting on XPRIZE. So we really look forward to getting regular updates from XPRIZE, hopefully having you back if we do a second season on this to just give us what's going on, talk about maybe some of the companies or organizations or individuals that are applying.
Oh, I can't wait to share that.
Yeah. So again, thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. It's my absolute pleasure to be here, and look forward to keeping you all in the loop as this prize continues. It's going to be the most exciting 7 years in human history.
Well, there you have it. Our first full episode of Alternatively Speaking. Thank you to Jamie Justice. Jamie serves as the Executive Vice President of the Health Domain at XPRIZE Foundation, as well as Adjunct Professor in Internal Medicine section of Gerontology and Geriatric Medicine and Sticht Center on Healthy Aging and Alzheimer's Prevention at Wake Forest University School of Medicine. What Jamie and the team at XPRIZE are doing is truly transformational. To learn more, check them out at xprize.com to see how the 7-year, $101 million global competition to revolutionize the way we approach human aging is progressing. It's going to be fascinating. Let us know how you like this new project. Email us at altspeaking@kcsa.com or find us on social media at KCSA Podcast Labs. Thank you so much for listening. We really hope you enjoyed it as much as we enjoyed making it. That's 457 takes, Shay. 457 takes.